Good afternoon, everybody. We are so excited to be here to share really a landmark conversation with you all. To introduce myself, my name is Chris Alexander. I am the inaugural Executive Director of the New York State Office of Cannabis Management. So we're here to talk a little bit about the program, and I'm so happy to be joined by my colleague from Massachusetts. Shaleen, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. My name is Shaleen. I served as an inaugural commissioner on the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission from 2017 to 2020. And then I co-founded with a bunch of other cannabis regulators, the Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition, in order to share lessons and ideas with each other. And I'm also founder of the think tank Parabola Center, which is a think tank focused on drug policy to protect consumers, workers, and ordinary people.
So we will be joined by one of our fellow regulators from Portland on the Zoom screen shortly, who is also a part of this conversation. But what we want to start with was telling you a little bit about the work that we've been doing, to tell you a bit about our roles within our respective states, and we're going to get into forecasting, one where we think New York can go, and providing you with some lessons learned from other states, particularly those that are participating with us today. So I think we want to start with the role, the job description. I know that for you, as similar for me, it's kind of figure it out as you go. How would you start and provide a job description of what your role was as a commissioner?
It was basically everything, right? So Massachusetts is about 4 years ahead, I think, of where New York was. And so after we passed adult use legalization in 2016, we formed a brand new agency, the Cannabis Control Commission, led by 5 commissioners. And we actually couldn't talk to each other because of the open meeting law. So we had to hire a staff, and much like your agency, start from scratch, creating our agency, and then designing all of the policies to implement cannabis legalization, from licensing businesses to reviewing all of their work, making sure all the products are tested and safe, and then making sure that the industry moves smoothly along.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have take a couple steps back question. I'm looking at the screen to see when Dasheeda is going to join us. But my take a couple steps back question is, how did you get into this? For our side, my day-to-day is similar, executing some of the similar work that you all were doing in Massachusetts, making sure that we have infrastructure for testing and leading and building this state agency. But I didn't think I would be doing this job. And I imagine, I know you had a long storied career in drug policy advocacy, but did you think you'd be in that role, and kind of what motivated you to get into it?
No, never. I never expected that I would be in this role. I actually worked on marijuana legalization for the past 20 years as an attorney, as an advocate, as a person who wanted to see the arrests stop. That was basically all I worked on the first several years. And then after working on legalization in Colorado, we started seeing, as the first states were legalizing, the arrests were stopping, but the revenue and the profits were primarily going to the same large, white, wealthy groups that typically benefit. And so we wanted to change that. So Massachusetts was one of the first states to deliberately put in their law that we would implement social equity principles, that we would implement diversity principles. And so we learned a lot of lessons along that way. And while we were doing it, many other states, including New York, decided to take the same approach. And so it's really important for us to talk to each other and share those lessons.
Absolutely, and sharing a similar background and getting my footing in drug policy and working to end the mass criminalization of communities that look like ours, and that's kind of how I got into this work. And one thing that I found is, or at least from the initial reports as legalization has started to unroll across the states, where we saw the drop in those arrests, but the disparities remained consistent. I feel like that was one of those trigger points that reminded me that we needed to do more.
Or in some cases, the disparities got worse, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You said a term there that I know folks are interested in and probably have heard a lot about, the social equity. And I want you to define it, and I know the folks who do this work, who've been in these rooms, have spent a lot of time with that term and analyzing what it means for our industry and for our marketplace. But give me a shot, give me your definition of social equity so the people here can understand what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in yours as well, and Dasheeda's when she joins us. But for me, social equity has meant repairing the harms done by the war on drugs. And I think especially the last couple of years, we've seen, at least in cannabis, we've seen the term used more loosely to mean repairing all kinds of different harms. And I always try to bring it back to repairing the harms of the war on drugs specifically, because when we legalized cannabis, we were not creating a new industry. We were regulating a product that has already been used for thousands of years, and we're regulating a product where certain communities, namely Black and Latinx, and in some cases Native communities, have been disproportionately harmed. And so that's really important for me as a woman and as a member of the Asian community, because I'm part of several groups that have been disadvantaged, but not specifically targeted by the war on drugs. And that's an extremely important distinction in my mind.
Awesome. I think Dasheeda's joining us now. The Zoom Skype call is ready. She's hopping in. Can we hear?
Can you hear me?
We got you. I can't see you, but I can hear. Oh, there you are. There you are.
Hey.
So Dasheeda,
Hi.
so far we've provided some quick introductions of ourselves and the work that we've done and what has brought us here today to this discussion. I want you to do the same just so we can catch folks up and also provide your working definition of social equity. That's where we left off. So we'd love to hear what brought you to this work, a bit about your current role and the work you're doing in Portland, and then your working definition of social equity.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Chris, for inviting me to speak on this stage with you. I'm a Brooklyn-born, Jersey-educated, now cannabis regulator. I've been in the industry now almost 6 years, working across the country to legalize with an equity-centered approach. Having worked on the ground in New York on the MRTA, I'm very proud of the efforts that we've made in the state. Like I said, I'm Brooklyn-born, so it was really important for me to at least address the experiences that I had growing up in East New York, Brooklyn, around the war on drugs and over-policing. Now I am a cannabis program manager for the city of Portland in Oregon, and this is one of the mature markets of the West Coast that certainly was started with a sensible regulation, but without equity necessarily in mind. And so over the last now 20 months, I've been in this role and have been able to roll out a number of new programmatic changes and policies that are, supported by the statute, but has never actually been implemented by prior regulators. So like Shaleen said, my experience as a Black woman, and only the third Black woman in the country to hold a regulatory role like this, really informs my approach. My experience also as a businesswoman, as a former senior executive for Target and Victoria's Secret, informs my optimization, because the government is a business. It's a multi-trillion-dollar business, and in the city of Portland, it's a multi-million-dollar cannabis business that we are essentially running to approach it that way. It's been very interesting to see how even good policy or statute doesn't necessarily roll out very well, and having a working definition of social equity is really where we need to get started.
Absolutely, absolutely. So thank you so much for being here, and for folks in the audience. This again, I know, COVID's got us down a bit, but this is the first conversation that we've had publicly. New York has been learning a lot from these jurisdictions and learning a lot from, I've been learning a lot from my colleagues who've been in these roles across the country. And so I just wanted to echo that as we continue to move forward. Now, Shaleen, I want to come back to you. In New York, and we'll talk a lot about this tomorrow as we walk through the market architecture design that we have for the New York program. But in New York, we were fortunate enough to have a really progressive bill. We've identified, similar to the MWBE statutes that we have in New York, we've identified some key populations that we want to prioritize in getting licenses and opportunities in the space. Can you talk a bit about Massachusetts' design and approach to ensuring participation of people of color, people who've been impacted by prohibition? You know, what are some of the things that the state put in place that you had to oversee?
Sure. Our general approach was to try and make things as fair as possible to begin with for everybody, and to have opportunities for small businesses in particular, and then on top of that, to have a wide variety of benefits, evolving benefits. As we learned more about challenges, we added more benefits for people who had been designated as harmed by the war on drugs. And then the third element was keeping other companies from dominating the market in the meantime. So I'll just briefly go through each of those things. So the way that we designated who has been harmed by the war on drugs was based on objective data, often called an impact study. And we looked at the regions throughout Massachusetts that had been over-policed based on arrests and similar data like poverty, unemployment, and then designated those geographic areas where if you had lived in those areas for 5 of the past 10 years, or if you were harmed directly by a drug conviction or a parent or spouse with a drug conviction, you qualify for these programs. So at that point, you can receive benefits through workforce development or job training, if that's the track you want to go to. If you want to be an entrepreneur, you have to own and control the majority of your business, and then you get prioritized review, you get technical assistance, and you get fee waivers, you get help running the business, and you get exclusive access to certain types of licenses, home delivery and social consumption. And as I said, those benefits are evolving. So as we hear more about challenges, we add more benefits. And then finally, in terms of big problems that we had seen in other states, in many cases, while these programs are starting up from scratch and you're figuring out all of these systemic challenges and how to address them, you have other big companies that dominate the market, and then you have a mature market, you have nothing left. We wanted to avoid that problem. And so we set a limit where one actor, one person or business can only own or control up to 3 licenses of each type. And that has worked, so that we're now 5 years later in Massachusetts, we're starting to see a lot more small businesses and minority and women-owned businesses up and running as a result of these programs.
Yeah, and so New York is modeling a lot in terms of our system architecture after what has been done in Massachusetts, and what really, to focus, what has been successful in Massachusetts. And we'll talk about some of the challenges they had and that other jurisdictions have had. But before we go back into New York, Dasheeda, we'll talk about some of the designs or the architecture or programmatic approach, rather, that the state of Oregon and the city of Portland have taken to prioritize or make sure that people of color have access to the industry. We lost it? Okay, all right. Well, I'll continue to talk about New York. You know, some of those similar approaches that Shaleen mentioned, making sure that we are able to identify, you know, who's been impacted. We talked about social equity as a frame, and it's been really woven throughout the legislation here in the state of New York, the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. We focused on making sure that there was both access and opportunity to participate for people of color and people who otherwise would have challenges participating in this space. One other thing that I think was super important that, you know, we continue to learn, and hopefully the next 20 states that move beyond prohibition after New York will continue to learn, is that we really sought to look at markets and remove barriers to entry. You know, in some of the initial states that legalized and started to develop these markets, items like, you know, your previous convictions were used to make sure that you were unable to participate, even though we know and have reported widely the fact that prohibition and its enforcement was largely centered in communities of color. And so that was something that when you got to Massachusetts, some other states, maybe, you know, what had dissipated, but we made sure that we took a full scope of those barriers to entry and removed those as reasons that people would not be able to participate. Similarly to Massachusetts, we have limitations on both the size and scope of operations by operators to create as much space for participation as possible. We've prohibited what we call vertical integration, Vertical integration being the requirement that a business owner has to both or also produce, process, and directly provide cannabis to consumers. By prohibiting vertical integration, again, our focus is just making sure there are many access points as possible and as many barriers to entry have been removed. One other thing that we also share in Massachusetts is the limitation on, as I said, the scope of the licenses. Really, how much can one entity own? In New York, we have a limit of 1 for our production, distribution, processing license types, and then for dispensaries, you have a limit of 3 dispensaries that a certain individual can hold. So these are some of the things that we've done in New York. What we also, I think, taken as an additional step is requiring that the state, my office, the Office of Cannabis Management, provide significant, meaningful support to these future entrepreneurs, both in the form of technical assistance, as has been done in other places, but also in zero interest loans and grants and direct financial support, which is a thing that we are very excited to continue to discuss and to provide to entrepreneurs who previously had significant issues finding capital to build their businesses in this space. So I want to come back to you and talk really about some of those misconceptions, because you mentioned what some of the tools that you had to use to narrow down, to identify those populations that we wanted to prioritize. What are some of the misconceptions that either the state or yourself as a regulator had in getting through that process and really starting to, in making space for people of color to participate?
As we've been talking, I've realized one of the biggest misconceptions that I had, and I think a lot of people had, was that once something was written in the law, especially a mandate for diversity or equity, that it was set in stone. That was not the case. Like, you hear us up here, rattling off all these benefits and the programs. Those were not easy. Those were hard-fought efforts. Definitely at home in Mass, and I know here, watching it in New York, the process took years to make sure the bill was equitable, and really the same thing happens with implementation and regulation. So I think it's a misconception that the rollout is just going to go the way it's going to go, when in fact it's very affected, I think, by public participation and by really who the regulators are, which is why it's great to see regulators like all 3 of us, and you especially, with advocacy in this area and knowledge in this area, because it affects how the program will be rolled out.
Yeah. No, that's one that puts a little bit of pressure on me, knowing that we got a lot of work to do. But we're hard at work, and so I want to go back to Dasheeda and talk to you about some of your misconceptions that you found.
Wow. So I'm not sure what Shaleen said, because I did lose some connectivity. So just being really honest about our COVID challenges with the connectivity. But it's really important to just also not underestimate, as a regulator, that the legacy market, the unregulated market, is a real supply and demand. And I think for my first 5 years in the industry, it really surprised me, just as a businesswoman, that we weren't thinking about that. In fact, we were never talking about it. It was mostly advocates that were talking about it. And now in the state of Oregon, it's something that we are having conversations about all the time. And we are also validating that operators in this space, consumers in this space, deserve an opportunity to be in the legal market. But that means understanding what I call weed market dynamics. A lot of regulators are misunderstood on weight. They're misunderstood on science. And then even in Oregon, a mature market, I have to remind people over and over again that cannabis is medicinal, regardless of the usage intent. And one of the things that we've tried to do in government is we've tried to dictate the usage intent, but the endocannabinoid system doesn't work that way. And the cannabinoids, or the active ingredients in cannabis, don't work that way. Whether you're buying from the adult use market or a medical program or a medical market, it's still a medicinal experience. And we have to regulate with that in mind. I often use the Advil or ibuprofen as an example. You can go into a drugstore and you can buy it over the counter, a branded experience, or you can get a prescription in the same location, but it's still the same active ingredient. And we have to think about it. When we look at the data out of the mature markets, we actually see that the top 3 reasons people are shopping the adult use markets are medicinal: for sleep, pain, and anxiety. And so I think that's a real big misconception that we found in mature markets, the policies that we are looking to figure out ways to undo, and to create, again, more patients access points, and seeing the adult use market as basically exploding that access for would-be patients that maybe do not want to go through the payment or the option of a medical program.
You mentioned, Dasheeda, in your comments, the legacy market, and for folks listening in the audience, the legacy market, as Dasheeda also highlighted, was what we refer to as the illicit market. And the changing of that framing is an acknowledgement, one, of the fact that folks are currently engaged in the business that many are looking to engage in the future, currently doing that activity, but it's also an acknowledgement by government that if we hope to achieve all the goals that we've set out, we have to find a way to engage and incorporate with that legacy market. Because of the fact that we can't sweep it on the rug or act like they don't exist, in trying to do so, in trying to build these programs out, we had to do so as regulators to acknowledge so that we know that how we can be successful. But the legacy market really is kind of an external factor that you all and that other states have had to deal with. What are some of the other external factors? And I asked this question because, the legislation and how hard we work or how we have to fight to realize the potential of the legislation is one thing, but the things that we can't control, like the legacy market as much, what are some of these other external challenges that you've experienced in Massachusetts or that you think we may have to deal with here in New York?
The two primary ones were access to capital for small businesses, which New York already has a great head start on. The second one was somewhat unexpected, and it was the challenges we faced with municipalities. So cities and towns in Massachusetts, I would paraphrase it as just did not follow the law at all and were not held accountable for it at all. So in Mass, if you're a business, if you're a cannabis business, you go through an objective process at the state level that's basically a checklist of all these things that you need, and if you pass, you get it. So we don't, compare people against each other. But one of those items is local approval, and at the local level, there was just no rules whatsoever. And so what we saw were cities and towns basically enriching themselves, taking payments from businesses in exchange for local approval, deciding that the state equity mandate just didn't apply to them. And it caused a huge problem, probably the worst in our state, but I would say after watching this roll out nationally, every state with the legal market has had a local process that, to use a technical term, has been messed up in one way or the other. So I kind of just want to warn you, if you are a business, the positive way to take that is, if you're an aspiring business or a current business, talk to your local officials in advance. Give them the information that they need to make good decisions. Bring them whatever you have from other states. Make sure that they see you as a small business, that you're the person that they can turn to when they have questions. That's by far the biggest challenge that we've had in Mass.
Yeah, and in New York, I'm sure many folks have been watching the news and seeing the opt-outs happen across the state. Localities were given a deadline of December 31st to decide whether or not they want to participate in the dispensary or on-site consumption aspects of the business here. A lot of localities have, and we anticipated that there'd be some, and fortunately those localities can opt back in at any time, no penalty. But we definitely have wanted to continue to engage with our local partners to make sure that they understand what role they do play. And I think New York is a bit of a different approach. Localities or potential business owners have to just notify the locality as they're submitting an application in their area. And the locality can submit a comment to accompany an application that will be decided at the state level. And so it's a little different where they don't need approval per se, but that they are given the ability to comment. I want to say something else too before we move on, just on the external challenges. And one that we are very keen to is the ecosystem, the business ecosystem that we're creating. And the reason that, one, how we framed this program and this rollout has been so important. Understanding the need for education and not assuming the education level of our entrepreneurs. You know, if we had some time to walk around and conduct a survey of the folks in the room or the folks joining us online, I'm sure we'd get a very different output of where folks are in understanding what the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act does and what types of businesses it looks to create and what type of ecosystem it creates. We cannot ignore the need for education, and I think, you know, as a regulator here, the one thing that I've been prioritizing to my team and to other state officials who are, you know, hopeful that this program is successful is that we can't cut corners on that front end. So I'll identify that as one of the external challenges that I've experienced, but one that I'm very keen on breaking through on. So I want to switch to a little bit more positive note, and before we give some more advice to the future entrepreneurs here, success, right? Program, Massachusetts is about 4 years old or 4 years ahead of us now. What do you think are those metrics that indicate success for a state program? What can New York be hoping, what are those metrics that New York should hope to improve on that'll indicate that we've done our job here in New York? I'll start with you, Dasheeda.
Oh my goodness, there are so many, but we've been calling it our return on equity investment. In New York, I definitely am looking at the cannabis tax revenue and seeing what can it do in the communities that we're divested in, communities like those in Brooklyn and Harlem and the Bronx that continue to struggle in the wake of COVID. How can we support the cannabis industry, support community organizations that have been doing it for decades without funding? So looking at the return on equity investment of the cannabis tax revenue to improve our communities. But then I also always take a look at how we're doing working with other MWBEs on the procurement side. We are tracking that as well, since we do a lot of contracting out of our office, and that's something I think New York should be looking at as well. Lastly, you know, the time to license, that, you know, is a little bit of what I have to look forward to, but also some of the barriers. In Oregon, it's incredibly long. It's a 2-year wait period because everything's so manual. So the advances in technology have now allowed for prioritization, a little bit faster movement. And I think that there's a big opportunity with New York in ensuring that technology solutions are employed to make it a little bit more customer service friendly, if you will, as compared to the West Coast, which has been, you know, horribly manual.
Awesome. Shaleen, what about you? What do you think it looks like? What does success look like for these programs?
I don't know what success looks like because we haven't seen it yet, I think, in any jurisdiction, but we have seen so much progress. In the local level, what I have loved to see is places like Oakland and Portland with the work that Dasheeda is doing, all of these cities that have been leaders, and Boston is now one of them. You may have seen we have a new historic mayor, first woman, first person of color to serve as mayor in Boston, and she has led a groundbreaking new local program that has really gone against the trend en masse. But then also at the state level, you know, we were obsessive about collecting data, you know, which doesn't sound as important against all of these other things. It turned out to be the most important thing that we could do. First, because nobody could argue with the data when it was coming in when it was not looking good, and so we were able to adjust and make our programs more robust. And we've also been able to watch as all of the metrics on diversity and equity have gotten better over time, which has been a delight. And then finally, being able to go to other states and talk about this. I know I came to Albany years ago to talk about this local question, and I consider it a big success when you're a state and you can come and represent yourself and talk to New York states and make sure that we make more progress each time we do this, because eventually we're going to be doing this on the federal level as well, and we'll want to make sure we follow our best practices from the states.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think those are both great. I would say from a New York perspective and as the regulator here, you know, I'm obviously looking at the key performance indicators, the KPIs, to make sure that we're you know, achieving our goal of 50% of our licenses going to our social and economic equity applicants. You know, those include service-disabled veterans, distressed farmers, you know, minority and women-owned businesses, and people who've been justice involved. You know, I want to obviously hit that goal, but I think if I dig a little deeper, building businesses that will last in communities that have not seen them. I think is one of the things that I would say is one of the biggest, will be the biggest indicator of the success we have here as a program. There's also, due to New York's legislation and the structure of the revenue disbursement, significant resources that will go back into creating more economic opportunity, both in reentry services, job training, and supporting other economic development projects in those same communities that have been disproportionately impacted by prohibition and its enforcement. So I think those would be my two things. That I guess it goes back to money, but it is, seeing these businesses succeed, thrive, and last. And then I think making sure that we're making some really smart investments back into those communities, which was a large part of the goal of the program and the legislation that we put forward in the MRTA. So that's a little high level, but I know we got folks here really interested in where they go, where they begin, how do they get started. You all are experts in this field, not just as regulators, but understanding the industry and having been involved in market design. Where do they begin? What is some advice you have for the future entrepreneurs that are in the space right now? And I say future entrepreneurs, future cannabis entrepreneurs who are in the space or joining us virtually.
I have a paper that I want to plug, but the first thing that I want to say is just, this is really unlike any other industry because you participate in building the rules. And if you don't take the opportunity to do that, trust me, other companies are going to. So think of yourself as an active participant, not just following the rules, but in making them as a citizen and a member of the public. So definitely follow the Office of Cannabis Management, of course, watch the meetings. I found that people who provided summaries and guidance of the regulating agencies' work could also often become very prominent and influential. That's something to think about. The paper that I want to plug is a paper I just published with The Ohio State University Law School. When I ended my term last year, I did not want to go straight to lobbying or industry. I wanted to take a year to reflect and make sure that everybody had access to these lessons that we've learned the last 5 years, because it's not just the concepts of social equity and diversity, it's the actual concrete policy lessons that we've learned that everybody needs to know. So it's a short paper, it's 10 pages, it's concrete, it's practical. If you want to read it, you can go to my Twitter at Shaleen Title. It's the pinned tweet at the top, and that'll take you right to the Ohio State University page where you can read it, and I hope it's helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to say my Twitter one more time. Shaleen Title, S-H-A-L-E-E-N, Title, T-I-T-L-E, and you'll see it there.
All right. Dasheeda, how about you? What you got for the people?
Well, I definitely want to just encourage everyone, since I came from retail, big retail, to think about the industry beyond just buying and selling. Most people really only have experience, especially in New York, with the legacy market, either as a consumer or the plug or what have you. But it's so much broader than that. And if you're already an MWBE certified business and you're already providing services, odds are you can provide those services to licensed cannabis businesses. So your pathway to participate in the industry is not just about getting a license, but it is about contributing to the total ecosystem. And like Shaleen, I've also been writing about this for some time. I have a workbook, How to Succeed in the Cannabis Industry, that's now in its 3rd edition, that is available on Amazon, Target, and Barnes & Noble. And it's really a great rooted to the tutor, every sector that you can imagine. It comes from my experience writing white papers from really large corporations that are looking, non-cannabis corporations that are looking to enter the market, and they usually start preparing years in advance with research. And it highlights all of the opportunities, the white space opportunities that have not been properly filled in, even with the mature markets. And so there's still a lot of time to impact the market. So you want to educate yourself and then get active, like Shaleen said, and oftentimes that means with advocacy in this space. It's almost like an imperative. You cannot be an entrepreneur and not be an advocate because regs are still being developed. And so there are organizations on the ground in New York that have been around for a while that have participated in the MRTA getting passed. These are ones you can join. Or if you're an entrepreneur and you have entrepreneurial mindset, you can start your own. There's definitely encouragement about starting and building in coalition. And then lastly, myself and Shaleen are both founding members of the Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition, or CRCC, and we have a website. We're easily found on Google, but we are providing as much insights and principles as possible for people to learn what this industry actually could do if we were equity centered in our approach, and not just government, but business and community.
Thank you, thank you. And I want to echo all of that for both of you. The Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition, that was the name of the organization. Please go check it out and learn from the folks who are doing the work, establishing the market in these states and the market here. I want to come back to another thing that you mentioned in terms of ancillary businesses. You all here with us today, you're here because you're entrepreneurs, you're business owners, you are already in the space of doing this thing or doing a thing. As Dasheeda said, that skill set is definitely transferable to this space, and so I want to make sure that folks keep their minds open to that, understanding that is always an opportunity to continue to do what you do now, but in the space, it's a retail business, cultivation, processing, all of these activities on our side benefit from the work that you do now. I want to talk a little bit more, just before we wrap up, about the opportunities that's here in New York, and we'll have a full-on panel tomorrow. Myself and my chief of staff will be here to walk through the licensing opportunities that are going to be in front of the state of New York in short order. But I want to just emphasize a couple more things with what we're building here in New York before we depart you today. One of the biggest and most important things that we've tried to lay out and make sure that people understand is that unlike other industries, unlike other agencies, other markets, you're not on your own. The New York State Office of Cannabis Management is committed to providing education and resources and support to folks interested in joining this industry in the state of New York. We are statutorily required to develop and provide these resources. So it is something that will continue to be rolled out to you all, to the public, as we continue to develop them. But I just want to make sure that folks are aware. I mentioned zero interest loans and grants and some of that financial support, but also the technical compliance assistance that will be provided by this office to make sure that the businesses that get opportunities here are built to last. I want to talk about that, before we continue to move on, but, what are some of the types of assistance you all provided in Massachusetts? What is one thing that you think was super helpful to people as they were trying to build out their businesses?
Yeah, a big part of it was just communicating and education and outreach, because if people don't know about these programs, then what's the point, right? But then also the ongoing feedback that people gave was so helpful. I would encourage you to consider starting your own groups. That was really useful in Massachusetts. I mentioned the exclusive access to delivery licenses that social equity applicants have. That was added a couple of years after we started because the applicants had formed an association and talked amongst themselves and decided that was a good idea. And that's where a lot of the best ideas came from, was from these groups. At lunch, we were talking today about, someone said, why are all of these systems so messed up that have been around for like 100 years? And I said, that's why it's so great to work in cannabis, because at the risk of sounding over the top, like, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to build this, right? Because once it is built, it's going to be like this for generations down the line. So whatever those benefits are will be determined by all of you. And it can be everything that other states have done and then more on top of it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. And Dasheeda, how about you? I mean, anything that the state has provided or the city of Portland has provided that you think has been super helpful to our entrepreneurs?
Yes, well, I'm really excited because we're the first jurisdiction to use cannabis tax revenue to create an emergency relief fund. Given the federal status of cannabis, specifically Delta-9 THC, there are a lot of challenges, and being able to have insurance for emergencies like COVID or wildfires, which all of the states on the West Coast experienced last year, and robberies, emergency assistance was not provided to the cannabis space. And so emergency emergency relief is something that I think is fiscal responsibility for a market until the federal government releases some of the hold on being able to, secure insurance and protect money in banking. And so I definitely want to call that out. And also, we are modeling after Oakland's technical assistance program, but we actually are, providing wraparound technical assistance for individuals who are looking to apply. Right now, we have just a reduced fee program, and that's because our state doesn't have equity designation, and we are producing state legislation to push that forward. But when it does pass, the key thing that I think is important is being able to have wraparound services so people don't feel like the application itself is a barrier. And right now, California has that in multiple cities. Oakland was the first, San Francisco, LA, where you can essentially get for free support if you're equity designated to just put your application in appropriately. And I think that is a key thing, because ultimately, if you don't take that shot, you're not going to even get a chance at getting a license. And that is, from talking to people, still the number one barrier to entry is how difficult it may be to submit an application.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah.
A lot of you are probably thinking about this already, but those services have to be provided by someone, and typically it's the government agency that does the procurement process to provide technical assistance, legal assistance, compliance assistance, or whatever it is for the applicants. So that's another great avenue to get involved.
Yeah, I thought we lost you, Dasheeda. I thought we lost you again. Before we wrap, I do want to, highlight, of course, the different license types. We'll talk more, again, in depth about them tomorrow. But as we talk, one, they're obviously ancillary businesses and the work that you are doing now is translatable. But cultivation, processing, dispensing, on-site consumption, which is, kind of the bar model or the smoke lounge model, delivery, distribution. These are all some of the license types that I want to make sure that folks have in their mind before we step into tomorrow. So you can start thinking about, maybe which of these license types are the place where I see myself participating in this industry space. And, you mentioned, Dasheeda, the timeline of getting folks licensure in Portland. What is the timeline in Massachusetts now, or do we know, or kind of has that been reduced, and how long it takes folks to from application to issuance?
Yeah, it started out as a really long time, but I think now it's about 3 to 4 months.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. And we're working to develop our timeline and provide some information to you all. Before we go, I want to highlight a couple of items, from the New York State Office of Cannabis Management. We are live on Twitter as of yesterday. So if you want to follow us, New York State, NYS_cannabis, that's correct? NYS_cannabis. Please follow, you'll get constant updates. We are also, we have a board that helps roll out work that's being done by the office. We're having a board meeting tomorrow, actually. So please, I would encourage folks to participate and attend virtually our board meetings, so as you continue to learn and see updates from the Office of Cannabis Management and the Cannabis Control Board. And then also, when you visit the website, cannabis.ny.gov, the website to visit, you can sign up for updates. You can sign up for updates based on your interest. If you're interested in being a potential entrepreneur or just getting general information as a practitioner or as a business person in the space. So I think that's what we got today. Any closing words for everybody? And of course, again, I encourage you all to tune in tomorrow at the same time slot. We'll be here walking through the legislation and the license types themselves, but I want to make sure we have some time for some farewell words or some words of wisdom to the future entrepreneurs we have here.
I'll just close with the practical bit of advice, which is that you definitely do not have to be a lawyer to understand regulations. Mm-hmm. So I really suggest you follow all of those steps and keep a close eye on the regulations and understand them, because you're the customer if you're the business who's supposed to be licensed by that. Regulated by that. And then I also wanted to add, this is very much a national movement, so I encourage you to get involved if you want to with the various advocacy groups. And if you want to know what I work on, again, you can follow me on Twitter at Shaleen Title.
All right, how about you, Dasheeda?
So of course, I've been saying for years we need to make the plug legit. I'm excited about New York having so many licensing options. Just so you know, the plug doesn't always grow. In fact, when you think about New York, there's a lot of distribution hubs. So make sure that you align your licensing type with what you actually do in the legacy market. And then the last thing I will say is that, yes, this is a national, even international challenge. I speak with people in Africa, people meaning the government in Africa a lot now around legalization as well. So again, as you think about your efforts, think across the diaspora. The Caribbean and Africa are certainly legalizing as well. And New York is going to be a big and important hub for a lot of those businesses. You can follow me also on Twitter at Dasheeda Dawson. And yeah, I appreciate having the time here, Chris, and we're excited to see what New York's going to do.
No, and I'm excited and really thankful to both of you for joining. Good catch, I saw that. For joining us today and sharing some of your wisdom with me, both here on the stage and the time that we were able to spend together to learn from the work that you all have done. I want to highlight, to the audience, the three of us who do this work on this level, we started as advocates in the field, and we've got business background, lawyer, and I've done a bunch of little things here and there, but we started as advocates. We believed we were mission aligned in growing and developing this industry and making sure that people their lives were no longer being impacted so negatively by prohibition. So, if you understand that mission, I think there's tons of opportunities in the space, and we are hopeful and excited to welcome you all into the New York State cannabis market. Please, again, stay tuned and look out for further updates from our office. Thank you, and we will talk soon.